I'll just be totally candid with you. I always, from the time I was about third or fourth grade, I always felt like I could learn just about anything. I remember before my mom died, sitting in the back of the car when I think I was 8 or 9 years old. She's up in the front with her sister, and she goes, "Hey, Brian, add the numbers 1 through 10 together." And I said, 55. And she said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "It's easy, Mom. 1 plus 9 is 10, 8 plus 2 is 10, 7 plus 3 is 10, and then you have an extra number there, so that's a 55." And there was something about it that kind of always made sense to me, but more importantly, and I attribute any intelligence that I have, I attribute about 95% of it to the fact that I've been reading books since I was very young. So I'm an inveterate reader. This morning I read 2 different books.
Brian Beckom, welcome to the Jason Wright Show, man. How are you?
Man, I'm doing absolutely fantastic today. Thanks for asking.
Well, it's so good to have you. You know, I was digging through your background, and like I said before we jumped on here, you and I are a lot alike. It looks like we've got a core job because we got to pay some bills, and then we also do a lot of other things to try to challenge ourselves, stay healthy. Now you've obviously got a big old brain on you. I mean, you are, I'm serious, dude. You graduate top of your class at UT Law. You go to A&M undergrad, a computer science major. So I want to start right there, dude. How does someone that's an Aggie and a computer scientist end up doing not just law, by the way? I mean, you're maritime law, which is just so bizarre. It's like, kind of give me a little bit of background on that journey, man, and start even before you end up at A&M and kind of take us through the genesis that is Brian.
Yeah, so I'll do my best to give you kind of the short version. So I was raised by a single father. My mother died when I was 10 years old and my brother was 8 of breast cancer. And she died as a result of some really, really bad medical negligence. I was too young at the time to really know what was going on, but long story short, she was an Air Force nurse, and she felt some lumps in her breast. This is in the 1970s. She goes to the doctor 4 or 5 times over the course of a year, and he keeps blowing her off. They finally do a mammogram. Nowadays they do a mammogram immediately, but back then they didn't do that. By the time they checked her, it had spread everywhere. She was given 6 months to live. She ended up living 5 years and then passed away when I was 10 and my brother was 8. So my father, who flew 200 combat missions over Vietnam, played football at A&M, is a member of the Corps Cadets Hall of Honor, et cetera, it kind of became my mother and my father. And, I didn't know what I wanted to do before I went to college, other than I was an athlete. I played basketball in high school at a very, very high level. We made the state finals 1 year, all district, et cetera. All 5 of our starters played Division I basketball, actually, and the tallest guy was 6'4". So I went down to A&M, which is where my dad and grandfather, Texas A&M, to play basketball, and I didn't even know what I wanted to major in. I hadn't thought about that at all. All I thought about during high school was playing hoops. And so I get down to A&M, and this is the early 1990s, and I'm a general studies major, which means I don't have a major. I'm just kind of looking around at what to do, and took a couple computer classes, and I'm like, man, this is super cool. Like, I really like the computers. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to major in computer science, not knowing that I would have to take calculus 1 through 4, linear algebra, differential equations, and a bunch of other math. But I was able to get through it. In the computer science department in the early 1990s, the internet had just came out. It was owned by the government. Email had just came out, but it was kind of useless because nobody had an email that you could email to. And but I loved computers. I just really took to them from the very beginning. I didn't like math at all back then, although I absolutely love math now. I actually read, believe it or not, this is going to sound like the nerdiest thing ever, but I read math books for pleasure sometimes, math and physics books. But in the computer science department, you were required to take another degree. Most people would do math, physics, electrical engineering. I had taken a philosophy course, which I loved. And so I got degrees in computer science and philosophy. And I tell people are like, okay, hang on just a second. You got a degree in computer science and philosophy. How'd you end up as a trial lawyer? And there's really two reasons for that. I tell people I spent 4 years in college in a computer lab with a bunch of dorks looking at a screen. And I didn't want to do that all my life. So I went to law school. And what do I do now? 25 years later, I sit in a room behind a screen with a bunch of nerds. So not much has changed. But then I think also subconsciously, what happened to my mother had an effect on me. And my dad actually hired a lawyer to sue the United States government. Of course, again, I didn't know about any of this because I was too young, but he won, which is, anybody knows anything about suing the government knows that's almost impossible. And that lawsuit, we didn't get a lot of money. Most cases against the government are capped in terms of how much you can get, but it was enough to send me to college and law school and my brother to college without incurring any debt. So I think subconsciously, I always kind of wanted to do what this lawyer did for my family, for other families. And so that's kind of I said that was going to be a short version, but that's kind of I guess the medium-sized version of how I ended up where I am today.
Well, let me ask you, where did you grow up?
Everywhere. My dad my dad, when I was born, I was born in upstate New York, Plattsburgh Air Force Base, which is literally on the Canadian. Actually, I was born at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, in Bossier City. But then when I was like 2 months old, my mom took me to upstate New York. My dad was actually flying combat missions over Vietnam when I was born. So this was 1972. My dad flew the last set of combat missions. I think it was called Linebacker 2. And he didn't even see me till I was 6 months old. My mom got on a military aircraft in upstate New York and flew all the way with a 6-month-old kid to the Pacific Islands because they were flying out of the Guam Islands. So I lived in upstate New York. I lived in Louisiana. I lived in the Guam Islands for a little bit. I lived in Kansas. I lived in Fort Worth, and now I'm in Houston. But I consider myself a Texan. The Beckom family has been in Texas for 8 generations now. So I grew up kind of all over the world. And I'll tell you something about that, Jason. When I was growing up, I was switching schools all the time. Really didn't like it, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now that I look back on it, it's like one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life because I have friends like all over the world. And so it was pretty cool, but I certainly didn't like it at the time.
Oh, I can only imagine. And God, 8 generations. So I'm a 5th generation Texan. So you got me, dude. That's
Nice.
amazing. And I'm one of these obnoxious Texans that's like I'll tell you that before I'll tell you anything about myself. I'll talk about my kids later, but the first thing people need to know, I'm a 5th generation Texan.
Heck yeah, man.
So the thing that you expressed to me really early in that story was something that I struggled with in my undergrad. I was the first member of my family to go to college, and I show up and I think I'm going to be like a marketing major or something like that. And I find out the math courses, you start talking about all these calculus and all this other stuff that you had to take. Whenever I first learned about business math and all this stuff, at that time, I had a very fixed mindset. I thought either you are good at math or you're not. You're either smart or you're not. And I was not. And so it ran me off. So I end up, like so many others, a communications major, which, what the heck does that mean? And even worse, it was a communications major that was with an emphasis in journalism. So I was really, I just picked up a shovel and started digging real deep. And it wasn't until I graduated, I never worked in any sort of a writing job. I ended up, going into business. Actually, there in Houston, both my daughters were born in Houston, and got into management consulting. Later, got my MBA at SMU. But I say all that. I had a very fixed mindset. There was something in you that you did not. You obviously had a growth mindset. You kind of saw that wall of math and those tough courses. Were you aware of it at the time? Like, how did you, and I say this now, and I know it's kind of weird to go back to undergrad, but to me, it's so relatable. And it's one of my biggest regrets in life is that I as I look back now, and I'm sure we'll get into this, as I've started really trying to improve my mind, improve my thinking, improve, just how I lead my employees, my children. obviously a growth mindset is part of that. Do you think at that point that you were able to identify that, okay, I may not be good at some of these courses now, but I'm going to find a way to overcome the obstacles that these present? Did you see that at that time and remember kind of cognitively working through that?
I don't think that was conscious, but I always, and this is probably not going to sound the best, but I'll just be totally candid with you. I always, from the time I was about third or fourth grade, I always felt like I could learn just about anything. I remember before my mom died, I'm sitting in the back of the car when I think I was 8 or 9 years old. She's up in the front with her sister, and she goes, "Hey, Brian, add the numbers 1 through 10 together." And I said, 55. And she said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "It's easy, Mom. 1 plus 9 is 10, 8 plus 2 is 10, 7 plus 3 is 10, and then you have an extra number there, so that's a 55." And there was something about it that kind of always like made sense to me, but more importantly, and I attribute any intelligence that I have, I attribute about 95% of it to the fact that I've been reading books since I was very young. So I'm an inveterate reader. This morning I read 2 different books for about an hour. Tonight I'll do the same thing. I've been doing that since I was in third grade. My uncle had read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and I looked up to him, so I started reading books. But, you mentioned something called the growth versus fixed mindset. I don't know if you're referencing the work of Carol Dweck.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, and that is a when I had kids, that was like a lightning bolt in my mind. And basically, the idea is, and there's some examples in some books she's written about raising kids. Like if a kid does really, really well on a test or something like that, and you say you're naturally talented, that's bad, because if they do bad on something else, they're going to say, "Well, I don't have any talent," and they're going to give up. Whereas if you say, "Hey, you did really good on that because you worked really hard," then if they fail at something in the future, they're going to say, "Well, I just need to work harder." So it's the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. And, my dad, my high school basketball coach, kind of imprinted in my mind, and my dad imprinted in my mind, never quit. And my high school basketball coach imprinted in my mind, you can do anything you want to if you work hard enough. And so those two kind of things together were a pretty good combination. And when I was taking linear algebra, I wasn't thinking about any of this stuff, but I think I had this mentality that even though it was a very difficult subject, I would just not quit until I figured it out. I've now learned, by the way, for people that are afraid of math, something that's helped me to kind of reframe what math is it's a language to describe things. So it's just like English or French or Spanish or anything else. It's just a language. So for example, calculus is just a language to describe change. Geometry, and there's all different sorts of geometries now, but it's generally speaking, is just a language to describe space and relationships in space. Trigonometry, obviously, is just a language to describe how to reference things with 3 reference points. And so people think about math as either a language or as like the longest. This is one of my favorite descriptions of math: the longest argument in human history. So it's just like an ongoing argument. You can really, it's not as scary. So, and I would encourage you, by the way, and your listeners that are interested in this, there's a number of really, really good books that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years that are accessible to adults that want to learn something about math, and they're great. All you got to do is go to Amazon and find them. But math is a beautiful, beautiful subject, but it's super duper intimidating to people. And I think one of the reasons it's intimidating to people is because in our educational system, we're not actually learning what math is. We're just kind of memorizing, multiplication tables and stuff like that. We don't know why we're doing that, and where these numbers come from. So I think we could do a lot better job. And the good news is with technology, I mean, there's all sorts of amazing online math tutorials and all sorts of things like that. But back to your original question, I didn't know I had a growth mindset at the time, but after reading Carol Dweck's book, 20 or so years ago, I was like, yeah, that's the right way to think about things.
Yeah, I mean, you said it right whenever you started that out. You knew that I might not know this now, but I can learn anything, and most of us can. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be, be crushing it like Albert Einstein, and quantum physics and that sort of thing. But you can learn almost anything, and that's one of the things and as Carol Dweck talks about, man, just throwing that little 3-letter word "yet" at the end of whatever it is that we're trying to tackle. I can't do this yet. There's a strong signal to the brain that I think really that makes it just for me it removes that roadblock of whatever that is. And I have really incorporated a lot of her work. I actually teach a course on growth mindset now to help people with that, because I look back on my career all the way back, man, from taking my first job. I took the first job out of undergrad simply because I thought it made me sound smart. It was with Computer Sciences Corporation, CSC, and I was like, well, it's got
Yeah.
computer science. I mean, look, I wanted to be like you. I couldn't code to save my life, but if I'm going to work for CSC that manages all of NASA's IT and has a management consulting group, then that makes me sound smart. Had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. So yeah, I really admire that you had that early on. Now, another thing I want to get into is this, and this is kind of where will be a good leap off point. One, I definitely want to talk about some books because I'm the same thing. You can kind of see it, the edges of my shelves here, man. I mean, I'm the same way.
I love that. I love that. Real books, real physical books too. I love that. I have a Kindle, but I've got I've started buying hardback books a lot. I collect hardback books because I love the way they look and smell.
I am the same way. And I'm going to tell you, you will appreciate this. If you don't have this app, you are going to this is going to make coming on this podcast worthwhile. Have you ever used the app Readwise?
It's the best app I have on my phone. I tell people about this all the time. Every single morning, I get 7 or 8 quotes of books I've read in the past. It is preposterously good.
Oh.
It's like, literally, Jason, I'm not kidding you. It's my favorite app. It's my favorite app.
I just discovered it. And so, the one reason I bring it up, because you say Kindle, I have my Kindle and it's old school, man. It is like when the old school and it's kind of slow, but we were about to go to Hawaii earlier this year. And I'm like, I don't want to take my usual like 2 or 3 books. I'm taking the Kindle. And I was reading both of Scott Galloway's book, his newest one, the Algebra of Wealth and the Algebra of Happiness, one for that. And I loaded them on there. And I don't know, I'm listening to a podcast, I think, and I hear about Readwise. And I am hooked because that was one of my things. Like, I hate to go back. I try to, like, I've got the Ryan Holiday note card system where I try to go back and, make the highlights and then categorize my note cards, but I'm terrible at that. And I'm not going to keep up with it. But with Readwise, it's such a good way to go back through the book and remember why you liked it so much and have the quotes. And it's kind of like a feed that instead of, the dumpster fire that's X and go through that, going through the Readwise feed is just magical, man. I love it. And I just discovered it.
And I'll give you a little tip for it too. So for your listeners, if you have a Kindle, you can highlight things and then you can sync it up with this app automatically. And then you can tell the app how many quotes you want every morning, whether you want certain quotes to come up. You can kind of tune the frequency. You can also do it with hardback books. So what I used to do with hardback books, Jason, is I would make little notations along the side. Mm-hmm. But I, to be totally honest, I'd almost never go back and look at that. Yeah. So now I got my phone with me, and on the Readwise app, there's a camera, and you can take a picture of what you're reading, and it'll highlight the quiz. Sometimes you got to move the bars around a little bit, but it'll highlight what you want to do, and then you tell it what book it is. And so I capture everything in my hardback books too. But yeah, that is probably my favorite app of all time.
It's a game changer. And you just taught me something. I'm glad I brought it up because I haven't even used that feature yet. As far as I'll use that because I like to have the book in my hand. And right now, let's talk about some books. So what are some of the most recent books that you've read that you could just say that, so everybody needs to read this book? You got any that you would throw out there?
The book I'm reading, and by the way, let's step back just a second because to me, like to say I'm a book lover, a bibliophile, whatever you want to say, is the understatement of the century. Like, to me, books border on magic because, like, I'm sitting there during quarantine 4 years ago. Nobody can go anywhere. But, I'm with Isaac Newton as he invents calculus in the 1700s. Like, I'm literally there, and I'm reading the thoughts of Richard Feynman,
Yep.
one of the best physicists. I'm just thinking, like, how magical is it that I can sit in my living room in 2020 and literally have a conversation with Richard Feynman or Isaac Newton? It's just preposterously magical. But so probably what I try to do is I try to have a couple nonfiction books going and a couple fiction books going at the same time. And so, for example, last year I had a challenge. I wanted to read 3 of the top works of literature of all time, and so I read Moby Dick, Anna Karenina, and Ulysses last year. Moby Dick is absolutely amazing.
100%.
Like, still today amazing. Like, you want to learn about the whaling. I mean, it is amazing. I thought Anna Karenina was a little bit overrated, although a lot of people liked it. It didn't really get me. Ulysses was by far the hardest book I've ever read in my life. I had to have a book next to me so I could figure out what I had just read. But I'm telling you, it is beyond difficult. But I read that thing cover to cover. It took me about 2 months. And now I'm going to go back and read it. And it's amazing. The books I'm reading right now, I'm reading a book right now by a Russian author called The Master and Margarita, which is beyond amazing. So one of my friends married a Russian girl, and she loves to read. We talk about books all the time. And she says, all you Americans, you think of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky as being the best Russian authors, but there's actually a bunch of them that you Americans don't know about. So she recommended this book to me, and it's The Master and Margarita. It's absolutely amazing. I'm also reading a book called Underworld by Don DeLillo, which is a fiction book. And then I've always got like a couple either biographies. I try to read 4 or 5 biographies a year, and I try to read a couple math or physics books at the same time. So I've got a book right now, for example, that talks about the similarities between Jose Luis Borges, who is a Latin American author, Immanuel Kant, who is a philosopher, and Heidegger. And it talks about how a lot of the stuff that they were doing kind of intersects. And if you're into that kind of nerdy stuff about infinity and physics and, the cat that's dead and alive at the same time, and it's a absolutely amazing, riveting nonfiction book. But I really, really encourage you to check out The Master and Margarita. It's amazing.
I will totally check that out. And it's interesting that you mentioned Ulysses, because one of my repeat guests on the show is a guy named Stephen Hussey. His brother Matthew Hussey, I think he's what's it called? Getting the Guy. He's like a big kind of love guru, a relationship guru over in the UK. And he and Stephen have written a couple of books together. And Stephen's actually an Oxford scholar. And he had always told me that his favorite book is Ulysses. And so I was like, okay, well, and same thing. I read that one, Crime and Punishment, and there was another one. Maybe it was the brothers Karamazov or whatever by Dostoevsky. And
Karamazov.
Karamazov. There you go. I just messed it up. But I wanted to get through Ulysses. It was the same thing, man. I'm about a quarter of the way through, and it's just brutal. But I'm determined to appreciate it. And I tell you what, just since we're on the topic for the listener, and you may like this too, Howard Bloom. Have you ever read any of his stuff that is like,
yeah, sure,
how to read, what to read and why, the Western canons, and that has really helped guide me through a lot of short stories, the novels, and what I've done is I've started pairing like a Howard Bloom recommendation as this is what you should read. Here's why. Here's some commentary on it, and then go read it. And that's really helped me. But Ulysses, man, it's one that I'm just trying so hard.
It's a bear.
It's a bear. And then and I'll tell you another one that I tried. Maybe you've gotten through this. Have you ever dug through Infinite Jest?
That's something I've that's David Foster Wallace, and I've given given thought to that one too. That would be a great book. The problem is I've got like Underworld's like 800 pages long, Don DeLillo, and then I've got like a couple Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon, and I've got all these super big books. It actually has started to be, quite honest with you, it started to give me a little anxiety because I have all these books lying around, and I'm like, I want to read every single one of them, you know.
Yep.
And I'm like, I'm 51, I'm running out of time, so which ones do I read first? But you know, Ulysses. Here's the thing with Ulysses. I think it's super duper intimidating to people because there's a lot of references that nobody gets in 2024,
Right.
unless you're an Irish history major.
Right.
So there's no shame. And like I said, literally, I had a book that would summarize each chapter. Plus, there's a podcast I was listening to. They don't call them chapters. They call them episodes. So there's 17 episodes, and it's a slog. But here's a couple tricks in reading that I think have helped me. I'm a super fast reader if I want to be, and I think it's because there's a lot of people that read that feel like they have to capture and understand every single concept before they can move forward. And the way my brain has always worked is I read kind of impressionistically. And so if there's something I don't get, oftentimes I'll just go right past it, and then later on I'll go back and figure out what that meant. And so like that's actually the way Ulysses was kind of designed to be read. Ulysses, they say Ulysses is a better reread
Mm-hmm.
than it is an original read. And again, a lot of that is because some of the language is foreign to us, some of the references are foreign to us. But the thing about Ulysses is there are passages that are just pure magic. And I tell people like the best closing chapter in any book I've ever read is episode 17 of Ulysses, which is basically Bloom's wife,
Mm-hmm.
her stream of consciousness, thinking about him and what's been going on. I mean, it's absolutely the most compelling thing I think I've ever read. But man, it's a super tough book. That there's no doubt about that.
Well, you've inspired me to jump back into it. It's literally right here on this shelf somewhere, and you know,
Chapter 3 is the toughest one.
yeah,
Okay, don't just get through it.
okay.
That's what I tell. Just get through chapter. That's when he's walking on the beach in the stream of
Yeah.
consciousness, and just get through it, and you'll be good.
Well, that's one of the things that kind of helped me when I finally understood that was what was going on, because I didn't know that was like kind of the first, Joyce was the first one to do the stream of consciousness writing, and that's what made David Foster Wallace such a genius. I mean, I don't know that he did the stream of consciousness writing, and the Infinite Jest, man. I started reading it and I was like, holy crap, this is just a little weird, man. But that's one of the things that does make it challenging. And you mentioned something there that I think is a really good hack for people that for the longest I struggled with. I would also think I've got to grasp this. If I don't know what's going on, I can't keep going. But I finally, and it was what might have been Jim Quick or somebody that I was reading to try to improve my ability to read and comprehend these books. And they made the point, kind of like what you said, is if you just keep going, our brain, our reticular activating system has a way of kind of remembering what came before and putting the pieces together. And that's one of the things that I've started to allow myself to do, is like, just keep going. And then eventually you'll figure out where you are if you just stick with it. And that's been a pretty good tactic for me. And I'm like you do, Seth Godin once told Tim Ferriss on his podcast, greatest technology ever was books. I mean, you can, for the reasons why you said, one, you can be completely transported to another time and space. And two, you can literally take the life work, like Walter Isaacson's book on Da Vinci, which was one of my favorites that I've read in the last probably 5 years, is
Great book.
Oh man, you can sit there and dive into, and all that work and all that both Isaacson and all his researchers and all that time, and then all the work of Da Vinci, you just get to sit there and enjoy. And it's so magical. And, it's one of the proudest things as a father. I've got two daughters, one that's 23, one that's 24. And they've both become voracious. Well, Abby, my youngest, has always been a reader because she wants to be a writer as well. Rylan, my oldest, she wouldn't touch a book. She was naturally smart. and then just kind of stopped reading in school. Now she's crushing like 3 or 4 books a week, and I'm so excited, and that's what we do. The 3 of us will get together, and of course, they don't wanna read all of dad's crazy stuff. Like, right now, I'm just reading for the first time The Fountainhead, and thoroughly enjoying it because
Yeah.
it's I think that the Fountainhead basically, in my opinion, is if you want to understand how to escape the Matrix, go see Howard Rourke. Figure out, go read you some Fountainhead, learn about Howard Rourke, and because again, going back to that fixed mindset thing, I was always for so long a performer, an image, and as long as I look smart, as long as I look good in my clothes on the ski slope, just don't watch me ski. I was that guy for so long. I want more of the Howard Rourke. Yeah, I don't care what anyone thinks. I just want to do. I want to follow my principles, and so I'm really having fun with that book.
Great book. Atlas Shrugged is also
One,
really, really good.
yep.
I tell people though, so most people read Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a atheist Russian philosopher, and she's also written some nonfiction books. But Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead are basically the fiction version of her philosophy,
Yep.
which is called objectivism. And a lot of people will read her books in college and then they'll never read anything else. So I tell people, like, be careful with Ayn Rand because she is so compelling, but her philosophy is not so hot because it's got a lot of internal contradictions. In other words, like, I come from the school that most things that you take too far to the extreme are going to ultimately be bad. So from a philosophical standpoint, I would call myself kind of a pragmatist, maybe in the kind of vein of William James and a lot of the American traditions. Like, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, let's try something else. She was really, really, really adamant about, like, the only thing that matters is is doing what you can in your own self-interest.
Right.
And the thing with that philosophy is that's largely true in a lot of contexts, but like, for example, if you were raising your kids that way, that would be a very bad way to raise your kids. And you can't really form communities if everybody's looking out only for their self-interest. Now, again, the issue with a lot of these philosophies is, the two big ethical philosophies over the last 200-300 years, I would argue, are basically consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is John Stuart Mill, which is basically greatest good for the greatest amount of people, and Immanuel Kant, categorical imperative, which basically says you should develop the set of ethical rules you're going to follow, and you should follow them every single time. And the point is, sometimes utilitarianism is good, sometimes Kantianism is good, but they're never always right all the time. Right. And where I think people and I've been guilty of this over the course of my life just as much as anybody else. I get really into a certain philosophy or a sport or an activity or something, and I'm obsessive as hell about it. So sometimes it's hard for me to step back a little bit. But yeah, who is John Galt? This notion, and by the way, I think it's important nowadays, and more important than ever, to recognize, at least in my view, that what matters is not where you come from, what the color of your skin is, who you like to sleep with, none of that stuff. What matters is your character as an individual and what you do as an individual. And that's where I think Ayn Rand really shines. Like, I think we there's a lot of very good people in our country right now who are supporting some really, really ugly political philosophies. And any political philosophy, in my view, that puts the collective group above the individual is a problem. And I would almost argue that it's counter to what you are trying to ultimately achieve, which is, if you want everybody to be treated equally and fairly, then you have to treat everybody equally and fairly. You know what I mean? You have to treat them as individuals. And I think that's, if I got anything out of Ayn Rand, it was this notion that you should judge people based on their actions, based on merit, and not based on the fact that they were born to certain parents or something like that.
100%. Or, if you start worrying more about a bureau or something that looks good and all this, then you have trains running off tracks, and you're trying to make
Yeah.
things safer, but if you're doing it from an ideological standpoint, you're going to end up making things worse. And that's one of the things that, whenever I read Atlas Shrugged years ago, and it was one of those books that had a profound impact on me, especially from a governmental perspective. I remember that's the thing that blew my mind the most was at the time I read it, I was like, this is crazy. This Ayn Rand all these years ago, and of course, she came from a communist, country, and had come out of that and saw the bureaus, the giant bureaucracy. I was like, wow, there are a lot of elements of the United States government that are falling into this. It feels good, it sounds good, it's got the right initials, but is it really going to be effective? And then, like reading the Fountainhead, like it's funny you say, yeah, you can't take it to the extreme, because I'm like you. I'm a family guy, love my wife and kids more than anything in the world. I couldn't imagine Howard Rourke being much of a dad, saying, honey, I don't care whether you love me, you leave, you stay, whatever. This is what I'm doing. Yeah, that doesn't mesh
Yeah.
very well. And so it does cause some conflict. Man, that's fun. So maybe you and I will, maybe we can get you back on sometime, and we'll just like tear apart a book and just kind of have fun with it. I think because
Chop it up. I love to chop it up, man. That's awesome. And I'll tell you, it's not just with the family context, but like in the political, and I don't talk politics that often, but in the political context, extremes are bad too.
100%.
Like I'm kind of a Buddhist middle path guy. Like most of the time, the middle path is a good thing. So, for example, you know what the largest socialist organization in the United States is? United States military. And people don't think about that. Like, what is socialism? Socialism is basically giving up income or capital or profit for the greater good. And that's what people in the military literally do every single day. They're sacrificing their individual, earnings potential in order to do something for the greater good. So I always tell people, like, when they say socialism is bad, I say, what do you mean by that? Like, yes, it's bad.
Yeah.
When we're talking about taking individual all the things that we already know is bad. But in some contexts, we're all in this together, and we kind of got to help each other out a little bit. And so, again, it's the extremes that I think that's where we really get into trouble. And it's like that in any walk of life. You have a couple of glasses of wine, you'll be fine. If you never ever drink at all, or if you have 10 glasses of wine a night, you're actually less healthy. So this middle path, I think, is a kind of a good compass.
Well, so now that we've talked about, and I agree with what you just said, talking about the books, you're an author, voracious reader, attorney, computer scientist. So let's dig into kind of, and that's why I think I relate to you so well. One of the question I despise getting more than any other question is, I'm telling you, Brian, when people ask me this at a cocktail party or something, it literally pisses me off, and they don't mean it. They're just, they're in the matrix and they're doing what they're talking. They're trying to make small talk. People say, what do you do? What do you, and you're cool because you got an easy one to point to. You can just say, I'm a lawyer, and people go away and go, okay, that's very easy to identify, but that's not all you are. That's definitely not, that's like one component of who you are. What do you think it is that makes someone like you decide, yes, I'm an attorney, I'm an incredibly successful attorney, but I'm still also interested in things like philosophy, literature, helping fellow man, all your health, these other things that make you want to, not just kind of give life like a little, side hug, but instead reach out your arms and just grab it and hug life with full vigor. What is it that drives you to be that kind of person?
That's a great question. And I think my first kind of initial impression is kind of two things. For whatever reason, I've always been super duper curious about basically everything. Like, I know there's a bunch of people who probably asked a lot of questions when they were younger, but like it got to the point with my mom and dad where it's like, Brian, okay, why, like, so I've always kind of been super duper curious about things. And I've also, I think, since I was very young, had a sense of the finitude or the shortness of life. And so there's a lot of, not only am I super curious, but there's a lot of things that I want to do. And I realize that I don't have an infinite amount of time. And in fact, that's good. I read a great book during quarantine by a Dutch philosopher where he totally convinced me that the fact that our life is finite is the best thing ever. And the basic argument is this, like, Jason, if you were going to live forever, you would have no motivation ever to do anything, exactly. Right? It's the very fact that we're here for a limited period of time that makes us all worthwhile. So, I think it's a combination of being super duper curious and having enough intellectual horsepower to actually understand some of the things I'm super curious in, with also a sense of like the finiteness of time. When I turned 50, I tell you, I was making conscious decisions about what am I going to spend my time with for the next however many years I'm alive. And one of the things I got addicted to 5 years ago was Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And it was to the point where I was doing it every day. And then at night I was studying the techniques. And I had to ask myself, is this something you want to spend your time on? And the answer is absolutely fucking yes. Pardon my language, but for a lot of different reasons. But that means that I can't go hunting as much as maybe I'd like to. So I've had to learn a little bit about how to. There's so many. I tell my wife 6 months ago, I said, there's so many things I want to do in life, but I don't have time to do them all. So I'm having to like pick and choose what they are. I love what I do for work, at least in the law business, because it gives me a chance to help people. And I really, really like that. Plus it's super duper intellectually stimulating and challenging. Every single case is different. I'm not plugging widgets into a board. So I love that. The podcast that I do, that is really just about scratching my own itch. So, you know what I mean? Like I'm talking to somebody right now that's super duper interesting that I would never get a chance to talk to had I not gotten this podcast ecosphere. So the real reason I do the podcast is just because I just love talking to interesting people. But yeah, I guess it's just this sense of curiosity and like, I want to know how calculus works and I want to know how quantum mechanics works. And how is it that if, you observe something here on the other end of the universe, there'll be a reaction instantaneous. It seems to violate the speed of light. Like, how is that? Like, I want to know how that works.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems cool to me. The biggest question in my mind right now, the thing that I'm completely and totally obsessed with is the idea of consciousness and what it means and why we have it. I mean, none of it makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And so I'm absolutely addicted to trying to figure out what is consciousness and what's its purpose. But, just at the end of the day, just curiosity.
So let's, and I totally get it. You're right. I mean, that's why this podcast exists, is a 100% selfish endeavor. 7 years ago, I was re-releasing a book. And I thought I'd use it to build an audience. And then it just became an exercise in what you just said, getting to talk to people like you, and I'm not a transactional guy. I mean, you will hear from me again, man. And, God willing, I'll be in Houston and I'll take dinner. And, it's, it has been the most unbelievable vehicle for meeting bright, smart people that otherwise I never would have been able to interact with. You really bring something up there that's, I want to land on that for a little bit longer. So in your quest to determine what consciousness is, because like I've read Sam Harris and I've listened to a lot of other Jordan Peterson and fill in the modern day intellectual philosopher to try to, for me, it just became even thinking about it. I don't think a lot of people, when they're alone and they're talking to themselves, they ask themselves the question, who's doing the talking, who's doing the listening, which one is which? And I don't think they ever go there. What have you found? How's that journey going? And where are you going to try to connect some of those dots and try to find some of those pieces to the puzzle?
Yeah, great question, great topic. Sometimes knowledge is more about what you can rule out as opposed to what you actually know. And so part of the consciousness journey is like ruling out certain things. And I'm fairly convinced that there's like no pilot in there. Like there's no, but people have this sense when they're walking around that there's like somebody behind your eyeballs controlling everything. And I'm here to tell you that I know for a fact that that's not true because I've experienced it firsthand through certain meditation techniques. And that's actually, it sounds kind of scary, but it's tremendously liberating. And as far as like consciousness itself, the fascinating thing about this subject is nobody knows the answer. This is the number one in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of a lot of smart people, the number one unanswered scientific question. And nobody knows the answer. Like there are theories, but I don't think we're that close to actually getting to the truth. I have, my own kind of theories. I have a friend who's a very big Catholic, and he always tells me, he says, it's not sufficient just to say what you don't believe in. Like you have to have some working theories of what you do believe in. And, my current belief as it relates to consciousness is that we're all part of we're all kind of tapped into some sort of something that's larger than all of us, whether you call it universal consciousness or something. I hesitate to use the words because they can sound a little new agey, but there's certainly a there, right? Like everybody is experiencing this consciousness or self-awareness or whatever you want to call it. And that's about the only thing we can prove. Like we know that we're experiencing that. I don't know that you're experiencing it, by the way. And you don't know that I'm experiencing it. So it's called the theory of mind. But the neat thing about this, and this is absolutely purely complete blind luck, is artificial intelligence, large language models, things like that, meditation, psychedelics, these are all converging. Like they're all kind of spirituality. They're all kind of going at the same question. And as somebody with a computer science degree and a philosophy degree, I'm kind of well equipped to think about this stuff. And then you throw the legal part on it. A lot of discussion about AI and the legalities of and the ethics of AI and things like that. But I don't know. It's I've read some amazing books. There's a guy named Douglas Hofstadter who wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, a couple other books on consciousness. And his theory is that consciousness is kind of like a recursive internal creation. So there's like, you basically create like these internal symbols in your head. And once they become complex enough, that forms this thing we call ego or consciousness. And it's a great theory, but he doesn't have any proof of it. And, there's some people that think we'll never be able to answer this question just simply because the way our brains are structured in such a way that we can't get outside of them enough to be able to figure out how they're actually constructed. I think the brain is actually a quantum computer. I think that's the only way to explain like the fact that, think about this. If you and I were in the room and I tossed a ball to you, the amount of processing power it takes to calculate the trajectory, the arc, the velocity, and to move all your limbs and stuff. You would need 5 million IBM supercomputers, and you can do it like that. And so I think there's something there's a quantum component to the human mind. And I think there's probably a quantum component to consciousness too.
It's I'd say probably in the last 5 years that I started really focusing on it. Learning, how to be more disciplined in like in meditation and really trying to get outside of myself and just realize that it, for lack of a better word, I don't think we're living in a simulation, but using the matrix as the most common kind of understanding of this is all just, you know, we think that everything is so concrete and so real, but in reality, it's just a lot of it is an interpretive kind of receiving and processing, like you say, on the computer processing what it's seeing and us coming to agreement on what those things are in some on some grand scale. And it's fascinating. It's one of the most been one of the most mind bending things I've tackled over the last like I say 5 years or so. You mentioned AI and consciousness and some of the things there. What do you think some of the biggest challenges as a result of some of the new technology that's coming on, be it Crispin, be it AI, anything that you can think of? What are some of the biggest challenges you think that the human race is going to face as a result of this also being, in my opinion, the single greatest time to be a part of the human experience? What are some of those and those things are coming to a head? What are some of the biggest challenges you see, Brian, coming down the pike?
Yeah. So, in terms of like artificial intelligence technology and large language models, things like that, there's a couple things that are a little concerning about that. And a lot of famous people have talked about runaway artificial intelligence and things like that. And I agree. I agree with that. The way that they program these thinking machines now, like for example, Google's DeepMind is basically like brute force, super duper deep neural networks where it's just like throw as much data as you can possibly throw at it and then let it look for patterns. And so I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but you ever go to a website and it says prove you're not a robot,
Mhm.
and it'll show you like a grid of pictures, and it'll say identify the bicycles or identify the traffic signs. You know what I'm talking
Sure.
about? You know what the real purpose of those is?
What?
Every time you do that, you're training an AI. That's for artificial. They feed all of those captcha forms. It was a Brazilian computer scientist that invented this, but it's not really to prove that you're not a computer. It's to train computers.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So every time you're identifying bicycles, you're helping like a self-driving car identified by. You're helping computers get more and more effective at seeing things. And
Wow.
like when Tesla came out with self-driving cars, one of the big problems I had, how sometimes people drive down the road and they'll have a bike strapped to their back of the car that'll be perpendicular to the back of the car.
Yeah, yeah.
The computers saw that as a car with a bike going the other way. And so having to differentiate that um, is hard for a computer. And so one of the ways they do that is with these capture programs. But let's talk like kind of on a just day-to-day practical level. Like, what if I were to tell you that Donald Trump there was not an assassination attempt 2 or 3 days ago?
Yeah.
And what if you were to say, well, yes, there was, I saw it on TV. And what if I were to say, well, what if I could prove to you that that was a deep fake video? Or what if you are interacting with somebody by email and I tell you, oh, by the way, all those emails you were sending me, that was an AI that was responding to you. That shreds the shared reality. That kind of thing shreds the shared reality. So I think in terms of like what I'm most worried about in this order is China, number one, because China is all in on artificial intelligence and they have different views on like the ethics of this than we do. So China's number one. And of course, I include all the weapons technology and things like that. But what I worry about from a philosophical level is if we can't agree on a basic set of facts or a basic reality, then our ability to do things collectively is going to be a big problem. And I think deepfake videos and large language models are an issue. You're starting to see, like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but you're starting to see like stamps that basically say this was created by AI. Like there's identifying features. We actually have technology right now that can that can authenticate things online, and nobody talks about this, which drives me crazy. So everybody talks about Bitcoin, cyber, whatever it's called. What do they call it? Cyber currencies, cryptocurrencies. That's the word I'm looking for. Well, none of that is the big deal. The big deal is the blockchain that Bitcoin sits on. One of the reasons that the blockchain was such a big deal is because there's been a huge problem ever since computers were networked, being able to like prove that the thing or person on the other end is actually who they say it is. And with the blockchain, you can authenticate that. And so if we start, the point is we have technologies that can identify deepfake videos and large language models, but we haven't deployed them fast enough because I don't think people realize what a problem this is. Like if I were able to, there's a great book by the science fiction author. You ever heard of Neil Stephenson?
sure.
He's a great science fiction. Yeah. So he wrote a book called Dodge in Hell or something like that. It's about uploading your consciousness to a computer. But the first part of the book is about a Russian nuclear attack or a Russian attack on the Mojave. I think it's the Mojave, not Mojave. It's in Utah. There's a nuclear facility in Utah, and the Russians attack it. And it turns out the whole thing was staged, and all the social media was made up. But there's this whole group of people that don't live in reality, and I think we're kind of already there now, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Like, and you know what I'm talking about. There are large groups of people whose only reality is what they see on Newsmax. Yep. You know what I mean? Or like I was talking to somebody, Tucker Carlson, for example. Tucker Carlson's like literally was texting people how bad Donald Trump was. And then he would go on Fox News at night and say how great he was. Like, how can you ever trust somebody like that ever again? And like, there's people that just don't get that. There's people that have kind of lost their conscious agency. Like I used to think when I see people looking at a phone, that the brain was going to the phone. And now when I see that, I think what I see is the phone programming the brain for the most part.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think I think that those are the big issues to me.
And that's the thing that scares me. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like the behavioral science behind what's going on with social media, and we saw it. Like you talk about the deep fakes. So my wife showed me a video right after Trump got shot of the supposed would-be assassin, and he said his name. It was a video. He said his name. He said, "And you've got the wrong guy." I don't know if you've seen that video. It was going around, and the first thing I said was, "Well, like one, the guy's dead. That can't be real. That wouldn't even make sense." And I was like, "That's probably a deep fake." And then it got me thinking, this is insane because it is gonna. Our reality is so skewed toward because the people on the other end. What's the there's a great book that was written in a documentary that came out about the behavioral science behind most of the social media companies, and it is scary how good they are at manipulating what people believe, what they see, how to get to their amygdala, and just basically just tickle it just enough to get them coming back and back and back. And I think now we're in a place where we need more critical thinking than ever, and I see fewer critical thinkers than ever. And one of the things, and kind of like you know, and by the way, I don't think it sounded very braggadocious at all early in this conversation for you to say you feel like you can learn anything. That just means you've realized that you can learn anything, and I think that's a very reasonable statement. This is going to probably sound pretty arrogant of me for guys like you and I that don't think ourselves. I mean, I know I don't think I'm any better or intellectually superior. I just think I try to figure things out on a very logical and rational level. And what I find, Brian, is that it's getting to be a lonely space. Conversations like we're having right now, dude, you've got to really search to find people that are willing to think and face some of the scariness that comes with thinking thinking about things at a granular level. And I think most people just love the dopamine drip that is their phone that they get to walk around with all the time, and they don't want to get below the surface because I don't know. I don't know if they're scared of it. They don't want to have their beliefs challenged. But man, for a lot of the reasons you just articulated, I agree with you. I think we're in a state where people don't even believe their own eyes, and it's just you believe so harsh. You believe what you want to believe, but and you've got people that are so good at tapping into what you want to believe. I think that's a pretty scary place.
Yeah, but no question about it. The good news about that, of course, is it's easy to distinguish yourself
Mhm.
because if you're a critical thinker and you're not caught in the matrix, then you're going to differentiate yourself from other people. I mean, this is a silly example, but I tell my kids, I've got 20 18-year-old boys and a 16-year-old daughter. You don't have to do a whole lot to stick out from your peers. Like if you say yes, sir, and no, sir, and if somebody asks you for something, instead of saying, I can't help you with that, saying, well, I can't help you with that, but I'll figure out how to help you with that.
Mhm.
Just that little one extra step, you're going to be better than 99% of your peers. So it's the same thing. Like, I use politics as the example because politics is on everybody's mind right now. But like, if you can't see that there's some good things that one side says and there's some good things that the other side says, if you can't see that there's some bad things that your side says and some bad things the other side guy says, guess what? You're not thinking. Like if you like, let's say you're a Republican and you can't say anything good about Joe Biden, that's not Joe Biden's fault. That's your brain's fault. Like you need to work on your mind. And just like if you're a Democrat and you think Trump is Hitler and you can't think of anything good to say about him, that's not his fault. That's your fault.
Yep.
Like, and again, that's a real skill. And the Thinking Fast and Slow, the
Mhm. I need to
Nobel
read that.
Prize winning book by Kahneman and Tversky. One of the and I'm a big Sam Harris fan, but Sam Harris is not as smart as he thinks he is because he's constantly saying things like, "Well, I'm not in any tribe. I don't have any biases." The fundamental point of Kahneman's work was even if you know about your own biases, you will still have them. And so Sam has forgotten that part. And I would say, well, Sam, what tribe am I in? Well, Sam, you're in the wealthy, grew up with a bunch of money in California, intellectual crowd. Like, have you ever noticed every time Sam wants to have a quote black person on his podcast, it's always some nerdy professor?
Mhm.
Like, those weren't the guys I was playing basketball with.
Yeah.
You should have one of those guys on your podcast, right?
Yep.
But guess what, Sam? You're not in that tribe, which is not a criticism necessarily of Sam as a person. It's just that he has blind spots, just like I have blind spots, just like you have blind spots. So the point I'm bringing up is anybody it doesn't matter how much you meditate. It doesn't matter how many books you read about cognitive biases and stuff. You will still have them. Everybody has. Like, there's no way around
Well, it's a
that.
survival mechanism, right? I mean, it's
It's a survival mechanism. Yeah, the trick is most people are never aware of it. And if you can just be aware of it a little bit,
Mhm.
you're better than 99% of the other people, at least in terms of being aware of, some of the flaws in the way we're designed, at least the way our minds are designed.
Could not agree more. That's one of the things that I actually had Gad Sad on the podcast, and we covered. I was like,
Nice.
it's one thing to say that you have these biases and just you're evil or whatever, and if you have them and don't recognize them, the thing is we have a lot of patterns from our evolutionary. He's an evolutionary biologist, so we talked about this. We still have a lot of those same things that make us function for survival. It's the difference of being able to have those instincts and being able to tell yourself consciously right now in 2024, wait a minute, you're feeling this, your amygdala is sending an alert, but guess what? There are no saber-toothed tigers around here. So chill out. It's just it's this instinctive warning about fill in, let the saber-toothed tiger be a metaphor for whatever that you're having a fear of or some sort of thought. But now we have to be able to stop and process and go, wait, that's going to happen. I agree, man. If more people would just stop and think and process their thoughts more, and especially where it's fully available, like politics and everything, to be able to just really process your understanding of things, we'd be a lot better off. I want to have one quick dad brag moment because you just said something that I have a case in point example, and I know you'll appreciate this as a father. So my youngest daughter, Abby, she went out to the University of Colorado, Boulder, for college, and because it was far away, she loved Colorado, she loved Boulder, and then so I was proud of her for getting out there and doing that. I mean, this is my daughter who, by the way, had to use a GPS. I live in Tyler, Texas, small town. She was using a GPS her senior year to get to the restaurant that she'd been going to for her whole life. That was like 5 miles from
Yeah.
our house. Then she decides she wants to start out in New York after she graduates. She goes there on her own, gets a job. She's working on Fifth Avenue, right next door to Trump Tower, in wealth management, which she never thought she'd do. And you're gonna love this, Brian. So the founder of the firm, that's an old school Ivy League, just I mean, these their whole client base is like these wealthy Manhattanites. Isabella Rossellini is one of their clients whose money that they manage. So, and then they hired the Texas girl, which they didn't want to hire for a Texan because they thought she was going to get homesick and want to go home. They didn't want to hire her because she was right out of college. They end up taking a chance on her after all these rounds of interviews and flying a couple times up to New York. The founder of the firm called me over Christmas to say how happy they were to have Abby in the firm, and
Nice.
and now one of the top portfolio manager there. She's a woman that has become a total mentor to Abby and has really taken her under her wing. And I told Abby, it's because you're not entitled. I mean, literally, it's not. I mean, Abby feels so lucky to have that job. She feels so thankful that she gets to be in New York. And when she first, she couldn't afford to live in the city when she first got there. So she's out in Jersey City taking 4 trains in, getting there at 7:30 a.m. I mean, it was a haul. And she's type 1 diabetic. So everything she does is kind of a little harder. And but she's thankful she's got the job. She's grateful. She's not entitled. I'm sure she said they have kind of stopped her from saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, because it's New York. But
Yeah.
same thing,
Yeah.
man. And it's the same thing with Rylan. I had her. She's my oldest. I had her show up to an event with me here recently. She blew everybody away just by exercising good manners, maturity. And one of the things I did with my girls growing up, Brian, is that I never spoke to them like children. I always spoke to them like little adults. Now I was sweet and kind, whenever they were hurt or whatever, but I always spoke with normal language. They always had to go up and shake hands and look people in the eye and introduce themselves. And what you said about your kids and what you said to your kids is exactly what I told Rylan and Abby when they were young. I said, I don't care what the rest of the kids in your generation are doing. You will stand out. They will be serving you fries because you're just going to do the simple basics that don't require brains, that don't require a lot of talent, that just require you to just step it up and be conscious of who you are. And man, it's paid off. And Abby, that's a big one because it's New York, it's Manhattan, and she was a knew no one, and she's made a life for herself there. And you can tell, man, literally make such a big deal out of Abby, not because she's the brightest kid there. It's literally just because she wouldn't even ask. It was supposed to. She was supposed to be snowed in this past Thanksgiving, and she said, "Dad, I think I'm going to get snowed in, but I'm not going to ask off. I don't want to do that this early." I said, "Babe, don't worry about it. If you have to stay, you stay. I'll fly out on Black Friday, and you and I'll have a daddy-daughter Thanksgiving." She got to come home,
Nice.
but she was like, and like most kids these days would be like, on Tuesday, hey, do we get the week off? Abby's
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
I'm not asking off. I might get snowed in, Dad. Just understand. Got it. So anyway, you said that, thank you. This is your interview, but I had to take the liberty of bragging on my.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, and that's because you raised them right.
Well,
That's why that is. So, and I'll bet you, you said something there about talking to them like little adults. I've always done the exact same thing. I've never had the little kiddie language or anything. I try to talk to him, and like some of the times, my kids, again, 20, 18, and 16, they'll say sentences and words, and I'll be like, my 16-year-old daughter's like, well, Dad, paradoxically, such and such. And I'm like, where did you learn that from? And I realized like she learned that from my wife and I.
Awesome.
And like listening to us talking to them. And, it's pretty neat. I actually have a theory that if you have multiple kids, the first one gets their language from the parents, and then everyone after that gets them from the older siblings. So my oldest son, Gus, got his language abilities from his mother and I, and then his younger brother and his younger sister got it from Gus.
That's awesome. I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Man, Brian, this has been fun. Do we need to cover anything else, dude? Or will you come back?
I'd absolutely love to come back, and I'll tell you what, I'd love to have you on my show sometime too. This has been a fantastic conversation. You were exactly right at the beginning of the show when you said we had a lot in common, and we could sit here and talk for another 3 hours, and we wouldn't even realize it was 3 hours. So absolutely, this has been an absolute joy.
Likewise, brother, and I appreciate it. I'm honored by that. I'd be honored to be on your podcast. What this reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever listened to James Altucher, but he has Dr. Brian Keating on his show regularly. And that's what they do. They just riff on these topics. I'm like, and I found a kindred spirit in you. So I like, this is so fun for me, man. So I appreciate you making the time and keep, stay curious, dude. I mean, I think that
you too.
Absolutely, brother. And you and I'll keep coming back and trading notes. It'll be a lot of fun.
Thank you, man.
All right, brother. Thanks, Prime. Well, that does it for this episode of The Jason Wright Show. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a Texas Titan Media production. Fourth Wall did the music. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Please consider going out to jasonwrightnow.com and signing up for the Vitruvian Letter. Also, please go out to iTunes. It takes like 30 seconds to just leave us a 5-star rating. It does wonders for the podcast. I would be so grateful. And with that, until we meet again, go crush it and endeavor to improve always in all ways. I'm out.